Hi, everybody. Welcome. You have joined for Gateways and Dialogue. We're going to give it a minute or two to let everybody join. You've joined with your cameras off and you're muted. You're welcome to turn your camera on if you like. We just like to assume privacy at the beginning of these. And why don't you in the chat say where you're joining us from? Got somebody from Colorado. All right, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And if more people join, we will let them in as they join. But in an effort to honor the time of everybody who is here, we can jump in. Stephen, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Stephen Lee. I am the director of the American Family Immigration History Center, which is a research facility inside the National Museum of Immigration on Ellis Island. I am in New York City right now.
Thank you, Stephen. I am Danielle Wetmore. I'm the Director of Education for the Angel Island Immigration Station Foundation. Stephen and I are joined by Gabriel Lee. Gabriel, who's waving, he will be in the chat. And so if you have questions or comments as we're making our way through this, stick them in the chat and Gabe will get my attention and Stephen's attention as necessary to clarify things or answer questions. He might also just be able to answer some things in the chat too, depending on what's going on. But if you have any tech issues or things like that, chat and Gabe, that's the place to go. As we're going through this, you are welcome to turn your camera on if you would like to create sort of that sense of community here. You're not required, but please do stay on mute throughout the program. We all are in areas where there's probably some commotion that might happen at one time or another. And so just to make sure that we can all hear the speaker, we will ask to stay on mute during that. At the very end of the program, if you'd like to unmute to share a thought or question, that's fine too. We will be sharing our screens to show slideshows. If you would like closed captioning to be turned on for you, you can do that on your Zoom menu bar. If you don't see it, closed captioning exactly available, if you hit more, which is often with 3 dots, you can turn it on that way. It's available on your own computer for your own device. So we don't turn it on for everybody. That being said, we've got a lot of ground to cover because we have to compare 2 coasts. We have to have 2 different gateways be in dialogue with one another. And so I will start us off on the West Coast. So this image here is where I wanted to start because this is an image of San Francisco in 1867. San Francisco in 1867 is a very different place than San Francisco is today. It was much smaller. It had grown a lot because of the gold rush, absolutely. But isn't a huge metropolis. And so thinking about that perspective, this is the San Francisco we're looking at, right? There are ships here. This is, well, this is down by the Embarcadero. The Embarcadero extends. There's a landfill that ends up being pushed out this way further. So this is most specifically a little bit inland from the Embarcadero. And I have an overlaid map that I'll be able to show you throughout this program. But people were coming in 1867 to the United States, to California, mostly from Asia, if you were coming this direction, but not exclusively. And the word that I'm trying to think of, the shipping company, the Pacific Mail Company, there we go. The Pacific Mail Company, they started running this route in 1867. And so here we can see two of their major ships that they ran, actually three. This one, apparently the city of Peking and the city of Tokyo, the ships look the same. They were built in 1874. They are steamships. And the city of Sydney, built in 1875, is also referenced in some newspaper articles that I was looking at from the period. The journey at this time on these steamships would take about a month to 3 weeks, but that's much faster than the previous ships that had been used. But once the ship gets to California, it gets to San Francisco, then what? Well, originally this shipping route became popular, had all of these ships running on it because the federal government was subsidizing them to be able to run mail. So mail was the reason they existed, but then also cargo. Cargo was huge on these ships. But then people started to board these ships as well, and they were used as major sites of migration. But where you got off the ship, right, which was this, is a shipping yard. There were customs officers there, but the customs officers were looking at goods. A lot of them, we can see here, this caption on this image says, "Searching Chinese immigrants for opium at San Francisco." So this actually, the concern of the customs inspectors are not the people. They aren't that concerned about the people that much. They're concerned about the goods that they are bringing in. So if thinking about going through customs at an airport, right, it's similar. They're looking for what you're bringing in, and if you're allowed to be bringing that in, or if there are taxes, tariffs that should be attached to these goods. We can see from this drawing that it is a chaotic site. It is busy. There's a lot of people, and there are fences, but these fences are largely to keep people sort of in line. It's to funnel your direction through really a big maze. I know I keep going back here, but this was the shipping yard. It's not built for lots of people to be coming through. It's not built for major processing. It's built for the movement of goods on and off of ships. But if you were a person on one of these ships looking to migrate, move from China to California, how were you as a person processed? Because immigrants do face different regulations. And so before 1875, almost all immigration laws were different state by state. Each state ran their own immigration regulations. And in California, there were a variety. And most of them were about limiting Chinese people, mostly laborers and mostly women. In 1875, the Page Act is passed. It's a federal law, and it's looking to limit Chinese women from entering the country for lewd and immoral purposes. That is the language of the law. The law basically says that if you're a Chinese woman, you have to prove that you are not going to engage in sex work upon entering the United States. How do you prove you're not going to do something when you enter is almost impossible. And thereby it becomes a siphoning mechanism. The numbers of Chinese women entering the United States before 1875 and after 1875 are staggering. It really does limit Chinese women entering the United States. And so women are facing some of the most scrutiny coming on these ships after 1875. And so one of the options where you would go upon coming here, if you weren't allowed to be landed right away, was women were sent to boarding houses run by religious organizations. If you were somebody as well who was released on, many people were released on bond. It was a very common practice. That was the number one way that immigration regulations were being enforced. But if you couldn't afford that bond, if you were female, you would be sent to one of these religious organizations. And if you were male, this is the county jailhouse of San Francisco. This image is not from immigration. It's not immigration related at all. It's the only drawing that I could find easily that showed the building. The building doesn't exist anymore. But the most common way that people would be processed, and if not released on bond, was aboard the ship. So this is just a closer up view of this lithograph. So again, it's this building here in the middle. That was the county jail. This has something to do with the Vigilance Committee, something else altogether. But thinking again, showing just how different San Francisco looks at this time. It's a much smaller place. It is not a huge, huge city. This is what the Donaldina Stanford House looks like today. This is where most of the Chinese female immigrants were sent if they weren't able to post their own bond. Article that I read suggested that the bond for Chinese female immigrants was $500 each, which is a huge amount of money. It is very common to not be able to post $500 at this time. The Donaldina Stanford House talked about their role in Christianizing Chinese immigrants, Chinese women, and they saw themselves as saviors, saving Chinese women from sex work. Everybody they brought in, they saw as somebody they were saving from a life of sex work, whether that was what these women were saying or not. So it's important to sort of think about how these stories are presented and who's telling their story and where the agency is there. But again, eventually it just becomes, it makes more sense to keep people on the ship to process them there. They had space there, there were bunks there, and so they would process people aboard the ship. And so this is a drawing also from Harper's Weekly. This is the Pacific Mail Steamship Alaska. This is from the 20th of May, 1876, showing what the inside of some of these ships look like once here as well. One of the problems with this, though, is yes, you can keep people on the ship, and yes, there's places for them to be, and you don't have to send them to be, released on bond or to the jail or things like that. It comes with its own space. It means that ship has to stay there while all of these people are being processed. And that means the ship can't be moving with goods or mail. And for a while, the Pacific Mail Steamship Company was annoyed with this, but they didn't really have anything that they could do other than move people from one ship to another, which people were sort of ship hopping while the ship was in the harbor as they sent another ship out. But this came to a head in 1898. And that's what
Danielle, we have a clarifying question.
Yeah.
So is the Donaldina Cameron House the same as the Donaldina Stanford House?
Yes, because I believe it's Donaldina Cameron Stanford.
Got it.
This is a history. I'm quite honestly, that part is something that I'm also in the process of learning. I didn't know a lot about the bond for Chinese women being held there, but I know that the Methodist Church also had one as well. Thank you. In 1898, Spanish-American War, the U.S. Needs to use all of the ships available on the West Coast to transport troops from the West Coast to the Philippines. And that means that all of these ships that are in the harbor that have people on them need to be used. And so the Pacific Mail Steamship Company ends up taking some of their cargo space that they have along the pier and converting it to hold people. This becomes known as the shed. We don't have really excellent images of it for probably lots of reasons, but it's this center area here. This fence that you can see here, so this is a 1903 picture. This opens by the middle of 1898 to house people. It was designed, they said, to hold about 200 people. From various standpoints, it seems that it almost always had more than 200 people in it and was incredibly crowded. It was not purpose-built to hold people. It was purpose-built to hold cargo. So there's not a lot of windows and very, very poor ventilation. This is a picture of the other side of it, just really showing this is a working area meant to be having cargo funneled through it. But you can also see the Pacific Mail Steamship Company logo there. This is the Stanford Fire Insurance Map of 1899 to give a sense of where this is. Circled in yellow down here is where it is. And this map on the left shows sort of this whole yellow area of all of the different kinds of cargo and storage that are going through here. This sort of more lime green that I'm circling around on the left side, that is what was then created as the shed for people. So this is an article from the San Francisco Call newspaper from November 6, 1898. A lot of the research that I was able to find that talks about this history is coming from newspapers specifically. And I have amended some of the wording. We treat Chinese men just as if he was a chest of tea or a box of opium. We hold him until we get the authority to set him free, and the company meanwhile is responsible for his safekeeping. If a Chinese man escapes, the Pacific Mail Company has to pay a fine of $500, so you can understand that it's fearful. So some of these fencing and these windows used to be all open, but some of them were boarded up because the Pacific Mail Company was worried about people escaping. And this escape, I put in quotes because they're not held there to be punished. They're not in jail by any means. And they're being held under really poor like the quality of the space they're in is pretty terrible, which we'll continue to see. And they're being not, they're there, they're not being released. But the Chinese, the steamship company, the Pacific Mail Steamship Company is now in the business of keeping people in one place. So they are a private company that receives a government subsidy to transport mail that now is responsible for housing people and them not escaping. Otherwise, they're going to be charged $500. So we can see the complications that are arising here. The layout of the shed, this sketch here is from a 1908 image. This quote is from an 1898 quote, but they seem to align. There was one renovation of the shed that happens in 1903, but it didn't seem to massively change the structure of anything. But it says, it is a perfect honeycomb of small apartments, and the mat-covered bunks rise in tiers 5 or 6 high. So 1, 2 is a standard bunk bed, right? So this is 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 high, all the way to the ceiling. So we can think about just how high that goes. There were no tables to sit on or eat anywhere. So another article I saw described people sitting next to their bunks on the floor to have some space to eat. This says Chinese quarters. This says women's quarters. There were some women, but the number was much, much, much lower. There was a time when there were 300 people and 2 of them were women. So thinking about that number, but this space here was 1 room. So this Chinese quarters, 1 room had 6 windows and 1 exit. And by all accounts, the ventilation is terrible. It is really cold inside. It stays really damp inside. I read a newspaper article where they said that they cleaned the floors on Wednesday, and on Saturday it was still damp because there simply wasn't enough ventilation. This is part of a larger story by Fu-Chi Hao. Said the detention shed is another name for a Chinese jail. I have visited quite a few jails and state prisons in this country, but I have never seen any place half so bad. But he was processed through the shed. And people noticed problems almost right away. Both immigrants, but also inspectors and other people were saying, this is no way to be doing this. This is not fair to anybody. So this is VH Metcalf. He was the secretary of the Department of Commerce and Labor. And this report that he wrote stated, the accommodations available are of such a character that it would be discreditable in the extreme for the government to continue to use them. The sanitary conditions are so poor that not only is the health and physical welfare of the detained persons constantly subjected to serious menace, but the danger to the government employees and others is a matter of grave consequence. And the fact that it started to be of danger to government employees seemed to be a big factor in convincing people to move forward into changing the circumstances of this. Oh yes, it was 357. So on November 6, 1898, there were 357 Chinese men and 2 women. The standard time to be detained in this space, so there's not any great reports, but apparently in 1909, somebody studied a 6-month period. And in that 6-month period, 1,261 people were detained, and the average detention was 23 days. A notable person who goes through this is in 1904, Sun Yat-sen was detained in the immigration shed because there was conflict over whether he was considered a US citizen or not, because he was born in Hawaii, but it was determined that he had no claim to identifying even with the territory of Hawaii at all, because it was deemed that he had given his identity to China. But that is a longer court process. But thinking about this space, if you're aware of the geography of San Francisco today, this tiny green dot is where the detention shed was. And that used to be directly on the waterfront. This used to be water right here. But landfill moves out and makes it so that it's further away from the water to the detention shed. And that is the other thing that leads to the closing of the detention shed, is because people had to move further away from water to get there. And there was greater opportunity to escape. And the US government didn't like that and didn't feel like the Pacific Mail Steamship Company was doing a good enough job either caring for people or keeping them in one place. And so the pressure for Angel Island increases, especially after the passage of the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882. It does still take a while, but eventually Angel Island does open. And this is an article about that transition. I'm not going to read the whole article, but a quote from this article says, the immigration detention sheds on the old Pacific Mail docks, which for the last 5 years have been the subject of controversy. I would argue longer, 5 years. As soon as they opened, they were the subject of controversy of some kind or another, stand empty and desolate today. The change being made yesterday to the new detention quarters at Angel Island. There were 101 Chinese and one lone, sorry for the typo there, one lone and gloomy, quote, Hindu in the party transferred to the new home for the doubtful aliens. The time set for the transferring of the inmates was 9 a.m., but long before that, scores of Chinese coaches gathered around waiting for a last word to their fellow countrymen before a heartless government sent them across the water. There's also another article that says how amazing the opening of Angel Island is. and how much better it is than the detention shed. And I would argue it was better than the detention shed, but we have learned that the treatment of people at Angel Island still left a lot to be desired. But that is how we get to the opening of the Angel Island Immigration Museum on Angel, not museum, immigration station on Angel Island in November of 1910. In the interest of making sure there's enough time, I'm going to hand it to Stephen, and then if there are questions, we'll take them at the end.
Okay, thank you so much, Danielle. Let me start. Oh, it says that I'm not able to share my screen right now, but we'll get that fixed in just a second. So again, my name is Stephen. I'm the director of the History Center on Ellis Island. And usually when I talk about Castle Garden, it's through the lens of Ellis Island. Let me just get this into present mode very quickly. Okay. And it's sort of, the more that I've studied Castle Garden, the more that I kind of think of it sort of like World War I. We get distracted by the big event that came after. A lot of movies, a lot of TV shows, a lot of statues and memorials are dedicated to World War II, when World War I was really consequential to the 20th century too. Similarly, we kind of overlook Castle Garden because of the big thing that came after it. And there's so many movies and TV shows and books about Ellis Island. But I was lucky enough to have an excuse to do a little bit deeper dive into the history of this fascinating immigration station, the gateway before Ellis Island. And I realized that, first and foremost, Castle Garden is a building that outlived many, many different uses. If this thing were an animal, it would be a cat. It would have 9 lives. It started out as Southwest Battery Fort in 1811. It was a part of a cluster and network of forts that were built to defend New York Bay. The top arrow, the big one pointing to the right, is pointing towards Battery, and that's where Castle Garden was standing. On Ellis's Island, you had Fort Gibson. On Bedloe's Island, which would become Liberty Island, you had Fort Wood, and so on. These forts were never used during the War of 1812. So after that war concluded, they kind of just sat around. The Southwest Battery Fort was renamed Castle Clinton in 1817 after DeWitt Clinton, who was the mayor of New York City and governor of New York State. And at that time, it was actually separate from Manhattan. It was out about 200 feet in the water, and it was connected by a gangplank with a drawbridge. Then it was bequeathed to the city because the military had no use for it, and it was renamed Castle Garden. And it became kind of this outdoor space, this public resort for the people living in Manhattan. A rotunda roof was added in the 1840s, and it closed in that central space. And in the late 1840s, early 1850s, we start to see that landfill come in. And by 1854, it was actually connected to the island of Manhattan. A lot of famous people and famous events took place at this public resort. Marquis de Lafayette arrived in 1824. President Andrew Jackson was received there in 1833. Jenny Lind, who was one of the most famous opera singers, she was called the Swedish Nightingale, had her debut in America at Castle Garden, and you can see the depiction of that here. Also, like Danielle, it's really hard to find pictures and depictions of some of these buildings that don't exist in the same format anymore, but you can kind of see this rotunda. It's a grand space in terms of size and purpose and how it's outfitted, the light fixtures and everything. So then it turns into an immigration station in 1855. Huh, that's kind of weird, right? Well, why did that happen? Well, to understand why Castle Garden was repurposed for this, you have to go back a little bit earlier than 1855. This picture is the earliest depiction that I can find of what steerage class looked like. I'm not going to try to read it in French, but it is the interior view of a steerage compartment of passengers destined for California. So these are genuine 49ers. Immigration in the 1840s was a time when opportunity and motivation met. In the late 1830s, purpose-built steamships started traversing the Atlantic. So it turned a 1 to 3 month journey into like a 2 to 3 week journey. But even if it's 2 to 3 weeks in conditions like this, it's still a slog. It's a pretty tough journey. But if you were motivated by something strongly enough, you would make that journey. And so we start talking about famine immigrants coming from Ireland from 1845, 46 until the early 1850s. We see wave after wave of people coming from Ireland, set apart from earlier waves of immigration by their poverty and their religion. And so, as surely as any action leads to a reaction, in the US, the domestic scene started to see a rise in nativism. People are coming over, they're practicing different customs. At this point, the federal government wasn't so involved in immigration per se. There were a lot of naturalization laws on the books, but in terms of the day-to-day running of immigration courts, like Danielle said, this was a state matter. There were laws in states like New York that charged a fee or a poll tax on immigrants, and that was exclusionary enough. But in terms of we want this kind of immigrant and not that kind of immigrant, that process wasn't really in place yet. So as a result of these waves of new immigrants coming over, what they thought of then as new immigrants, we think of it now as sort of older waves of immigration. The New York Board of Commissioners of Immigration was created in 1847. It consisted of 10 members, most of whom were appointed by the governor. You had the mayor of New York, you had the mayor of Brooklyn, which was a separate city at the time, and you had the presidents of the German and the Irish immigration societies. Why the German and the Irish immigration societies? Well, if you look at the numbers, people coming through in those first few years of the commission and where they're coming from, the majority of them are coming from those two countries. In fact, in some years, the majority of people coming through the Port of New York were Irish. So including these immigration societies on this board was really a way of reflecting who was going to need the assistance and who was being documented as coming through. Immediately, there were accusations from people on the nativist side of the argument saying that people are just importing votes from Europe, that this reeks of corruption. You can see in this cartoon on the left, there is an Irish man in a whiskey barrel and a German man in a lager barrel carrying a ballot box away. They're literally running away with the election. Get it? So from this impulse, we have the American Party, which we call the Know Nothing Party now, originally named the Native American Party, and I'll let that irony sit with you for a second. It was headquartered here in New York City because so many immigrants were arriving in the Port of New York. They wound up having control of a lot of state governments here in the Northeast and out in California too. They wanted to repeal all naturalization laws. No more citizens, no thank you. And later in the 1850s, when they started debating in Congress what would become the Homestead Act, basically giving free land out west away to people, they didn't want immigrants included in that. But on the other side of this debate, you had then Senator, later the Secretary of State, William Seward, saying the ingress of foreign population into this country is a fixed and unchangeable fact. They came here in obedience to a law which obliged them to come. It cannot remain at home. It must come here. And inasmuch as it must come here, we are to treat it as if it were justly and wisely here. So in the middle of this debate, the federal government passes the Carriage of Passengers Act, not limiting who can come, but more concerned with limiting passengers per square feet, the hygiene aboard the ship, really protecting somewhat the welfare of people aboard these ships. And the New York State Legislature passed an act for the protection of immigrants, second-class steerage, and deck passengers. This created a mandate for a single landing site, as opposed to immigrants being dispersed at various piers around the city. Maybe they make it to a reputable boarding house. Maybe they make it to a train station that takes them where they need to go. Maybe it doesn't. This political cartoon is from the magazine Puck, and it depicts the dangers that awaited the immigrants as they left Castle Garden. And so you have a con man, since sex and violence go hand in hand, you have a temptress there waiting for these immigrants to sort of fall into their clutches. And this law was a way to address that. A single landing site that would operate incommunicado with the state immigrant hospital way up in Ward Island, which is at the opposite end of Manhattan, as part of an immigration processing complex, really more concerned, at least nominally, with the welfare and the well-being of the people who were being dumped into the city. Immediately, when they started talking about repurposing this public park, this public resort, into an immigration station, people had very mixed opinions, to say the least. Opposition was your typical not in my backyard crowd. There's this great quote about people who were afraid of prostitutes, rummies, watch stuffers, thimble riggers, and pocketbook droppers taking over Battery Park. A thimble rigger, if you know 3-card Monte or the 3-cup game where you're trying to figure out which of the cups is hiding the item, it's something similar to that, only they were using thimbles. And if you were pulling the pageant, if you were rigging the thimbles, you're a thimble rigger, okay? So they were afraid of these kind of, these they called them runners, taking over Battery Park. Cornelius Vanderbilt, who owned property nearby, said that moving an immigration station there with thousands of people coming through a day would endanger health and depreciate property. There are other quotes where people seem to be fixated on endangering health, and especially the odors that would be emitted from an immigration station. The stigma that comes from being an immigrant back then was that you were unwashed, that you literally smelled bad. So it's interesting to see what a visceral reaction people would have. There were also people who were supportive of this. The harbor master, physicians and local health officials, and of course the immigrant aid societies were all for this because they wanted to protect the people as much as they could, especially those first few hours that they were on American soil. So the resolution was that the commission agreed to build a 1,000-foot long, 12-foot high fence almost all the way around around Castle Garden. Anything that wasn't facing the water, it was enclosed in the fence. This would be funded by an immigrant poll tax that was collected. And swindlers and other rapscallions that were making their livelihood off of easy prey actually caused disturbances during the first days of operation. They would attack the gate at Castle Garden, they would attack the employees. So it was really cutting into their livelihoods, and they reacted really strongly against it. So the inside process at Castle Garden, some similarities to Ellis. Like on Ellis Island, immigrants would arrive via ferry or barge from the ship. They'd be examined by physicians and brought into the rotunda, which is depicted on the right side of this slide. It's said that between 2,000 and 4,000 people could fit into this room. That's a lot of people in that space. I've walked through Castle Clinton recently. Usually people are more likely to say 2,000 to 3,000 people. Any way you look at it, there's a lot of people in this kind of space. They would receive travel information after they had registered in the rotunda. That was something that didn't happen at Ellis Island. They were given soap, water, and towels to bathe before leaving. I'm not sure if this is a way to assuage the fears of people living close by that thought of immigrants bringing disease and dirt into their neighborhood, or if this is just standard hygiene practices. But that's definitely something, and we have depictions of that we can see in a couple of slides. It's definitely something that was provided to people who arrived. And immigrants would go to the baggage area, which was kind of a mess at first. Thievery was a common problem. By the end of Castle Garden's run, Up to 15,000 bags could be stored in their baggage area. Also, if you needed a job, if you had a reference, you could go to the labor exchange. Thousands of people were provided with jobs via the labor exchange at Castle Garden. Then, if everything went well, you would leave the gates to face all of those temptations and pitfalls as best you could. There is a Daily Times article from when Castle Garden was being constructed, describing a quadrangular desk being built in the middle of the rotunda. It mentions wash basins, this continually flowing trough of water in the bathing areas. The bottom picture on this slide, it depicts the bathing rooms. So this is really something that I didn't know about Castle Garden, that I didn't know that this service was offered so explicitly. And there were some benefits to a lot of people, allegedly. Immigrants would receive faster and safer travel. They'd receive access to food, money exchange, and tickets. The shipping companies could be relieved their passengers in a more efficient way. The commission could collect taxes, and government statisticians could collect data more reliably. And the general public could be satisfied with the diminution of human suffering and the dispersion of outlaws and scammers. Of course, we know that wherever there's an easy target, scammers will follow, but the principle of Castle Garden was to protect people from that as much as it could. After Castle Garden was built, the governor praised it, which you kind of would expect. This is a state-run facility, so the governor's going to say it's great. Local officials were a little bit more skeptical. Something that haunts Castle Garden throughout its run is accusations of overcharging, accusations of patronage, but a lot of these accusations were made by people whose livelihoods were sort of cramped by Castle Garden's existence. Castle Garden is going along fine, and then we run smack dab into a civil war. It causes immigration to plummet, but it's important to know that on both sides of the Civil War, about 25% of the fighting force was made up of immigrants. It created a demand for young men like Joseph Pulitzer, who, when he arrived in 1864 in Boston, had his ticket paid for by Massachusetts Army recruiters. In fact, an act to encourage immigration that allowed private agencies to sign up labor contractors was put in place to get more men to come over, fight on the battlefield, fill in the factory positions that were left by some guy who's probably dying at Bull Run. But as a consequence of the value of these immigrants and the value of bringing them, they faced really tough conditions still. The SS William Nelson was a terribly overcrowded ship. They were fumigating the lower part of the ship because disease was breaking out. They did that with tar pots. One of these tar pots exploded and the ship sank. It killed 400 immigrants aboard because they were packed in there so tightly. Disease started to spread. The solution wound up being what killed them. During this time, Castle Garden was expanding. There were 12 different departments handling everything from people who would get on board the ship and collect the documents from the masters of the ship, people who would register you, people who would help you with railroad tickets, baggage delivery, exchange your money. The information department would provide you with traveling information depending on where you needed to go. The letter writing and forwarding departments helped manage correspondence going into and coming out of Castle Garden on behalf of the immigrants. There were licensed boarding house keepers who had shops set up at Castle Garden. The Wards Island department was basically folks who needed to go to the hospital. You can see in this picture to the right, built off of the main building of Castle Garden, there's a Wards Island department outbuilding there, opposite of the labor exchange. And at this point, the compound's about 3 acres. By contrast, at its biggest, Ellis Island is about 27.6 acres. So this is a much smaller operation physically. Immigration in the 1870s, things are humming along pretty well at Castle Garden. About 1 out of 5 people are using the licensed boarding houses. There's a plethora of languages that could be interpreted for you there. The labor exchange in 1871 alone found over 31,000 people jobs. But there's a shift in tone in how people were thinking and talking and legislating about immigration. Danielle mentioned the Page Act, 1875. It's the first openly restrictive immigration law, whereas there were some restrictions before, but the Page Act really spelled it out right there for you. The New York law that demanded a poll tax on immigrants being collected was declared unconstitutional. So Castle Garden went scrambling for new ways to get funding. At the end of this decade, they also built a new building in Battery Park called the Barge Office, which you can see on the bottom left here. And then, it couldn't have happened at a better time, there was a fire that destroyed most of Castle Garden. If springtime is the time when kings go to war, I think summer is the time when immigration stations burn down, because Ellis Island burned in June, Castle Garden burned in July, and Angel Island burned in August of 1940, right? Something about the summer. This fire caused over $1.1 million in damage, $40,000 then. 1,000 pieces of luggage were destroyed. It was supposedly started by a Mennonite immigrant who was putting out his pipe and shaking the ashes out in the rotunda. Every disaster needs a hero. So John Lucy, who was a sailor on leave, is credited with leading hundreds of immigrants out of the station to safety. There were talks about keeping it closed down, but ultimately just about like 3-4 months later, in November, Castle Garden reopened. They scrabbled together the funds, they reopened it within the same year. So then why ultimately did Castle Garden close? It survived, it's suffering the slings and arrows of public opinion. Well, in the 1880s, the federal government really stuck its nose into immigration a lot more actively. There's the Chinese Exclusion Act, the Immigration Act, which did allow for a head tax. So there's some funding coming in for the maintenance of these hospitals and these shelters for immigrants. But the Immigration Act was also really restrictive. People who were a convict, a lunatic, an idiot, or any person unable to take care of himself or herself were thereby barred. It created a federal immigration bureaucracy. And the Passenger Act it prohibited people from bringing certain items. It also had some organizational impacts on how the outlay of ships were in terms of hygiene and medical needs. Also in the early 1880s, the reason why we see this legislation, there are a couple of things going on. There's a really big increase in, quote, assisted immigration from Ireland. People who were so poor, they were sent across the ocean, paid for, because that was cheaper than taking care of them at home, having to be long-term charity cases. The Tsar of Russia was assassinated. His replacement started a virulent series of pogroms against Jewish communities. We see an uptick in Eastern European immigration. These are very different kinds of immigrants than what we saw just a few decades before, in terms of religion, in terms of their culture, in terms of their language. Governor Grover Cleveland lambasted Castle Garden at this point as a scandal and reproach to civilization. The Department of Treasury started examining immigration stations because all this talk about people being ripped off, basically, with railroad tickets and baggage claims they had to pay. And then they passed the contract labor law. All those people we wanted to come under contract labor in the 1860s, no. That's not allowed anymore. We're not going to allow that. During Ellis Island's era, you could be deported for being here as a contract laborer. And that's where that starts. So this balance between state and federal power gets a little bit tricky for immigrants and civil servants to navigate as more and more federal interference goes on. Finally, Joseph Pulitzer, his paper, The World, helped raise money for the pedestal of the statue. He starts attacking Castle Garden over and over again in his paper, calling it a monopoly. There's an investigative committee set up by Congress called the Ford Committee, and they found that Castle Garden wasn't able to cope with this new kind of immigration. And they said, so you're telling me your expenses are bigger than your income. You're charging people too much. There's patronage. There's some graft going on, and you can't even keep the wrong kind of people out. That's it. We're revoking your contract. We are going to dedicate $75,000, just about $2.5 million in today's money, to build a new immigration station on what's Ellis Island. And on April 18th of 1890, the very last immigrants were processed at Castle Garden. There was a little bit over 400 of them. So really it goes out with a whimper instead of a bang. Those daily functions moved to the barge office until Ellis Island is up and running in 1892. All of the state-run immigration stations are shut down and taken over by the federal government in 1891. And then Castle Garden becomes the New York City Aquarium. It looks really different on the inside in this picture. All those outbuildings are taken away. And so I'm really fascinated by just how many people came through Castle Garden. During its era, we had over 8 million people coming through New York City. That's about 76% of all the people that came through the US. In this graph, the blue bar is US total. The orange bar are just those people who came through Castle Garden. And there are a lot of years where that orange bar is almost as tall as the blue bar. We can't talk about the people who came without talking about the people who were turned away. This was really difficult information to find because Castle Garden wasn't really a place of inspection and deportation the way we think of Ellis Island. Ellis Island, it averages about 2% of people a year. You don't get anywhere close to that at Castle Garden. Those early years, you're barely getting 0.1, 0.2, 0.3%. Those later years, when federal immigration laws start getting more restrictive, you do see an uptick, but we're talking about less than 1/2 of 1 percentage point of everybody coming through. Something else that really stands out to me are the blend of ethnicities represented at Castle Garden. The biggest group that came through Ellis Island far and away are Italians. But during Castle Garden's era, the Italians and the Swedes are tied at 3%. And the biggest groups coming through Castle Garden are Germans and Irish, and then English. So themes of Castle Garden is really of a lot of transition that's going on. You're transitioning from old immigration to new immigration, not just in terms of technology and the length of the voyage, but also in where they're coming from. As a result, you move from a stance of these laws are going to protect immigrants to they're going to protect America from certain kinds of immigrants. You do that by changing from documentation and registration to more focus on inspection. You go by changing labor laws where labor is welcome under contract labor and then prohibited. And you do that by concentrating power from state to federal. But also at Ellis Island, Castle Garden, there are some constants. Money will always talk. Immigrants will always be easy prey for people. And when you're talking about wooden buildings with paper documents, there's always the threat of the odd fire breaking out in the summer season. So that's why I'm really glad I got a chance to learn a little bit more about Castle Garden and why I think without Castle Garden, Ellis Island wouldn't have been what it was. So thank you guys.
Yeah, thank you. I'm really struck by thinking about the comparison and the ways that different officials were thinking about immigrants, whether they were threats or welcome or who they were threatening to, and how that was shifting the conversation both on both coasts.
Yeah.
But wanted to open this up to any questions or noticing of themes across from the group. You can put them in the chat, or if you want, you can unmute yourself too.
I have a question for Danielle. I'll get us rolling here. One thing I noticed, especially early on, and a little bit before Castle Garden opened as an immigration station, the way it was approached was, well, we want to legislate the conditions in which people travel, because if the conditions are so bad, logically speaking, they'll get sick on the voyage. And then we'll have this sick person who's unable to get a job and contribute to the local economy. So we're going to keep them at least above that bare minimum. But the conditions in the shed were so antithetical to good health, fresh air, the fresh running water troughs at Castle Garden. Was that logic not, did that logic not logic on the West Coast at that time?
Seemed like no. That I read an article, and it's really hard to find any like resources or statistics or numbers or documents from the time of the shed, because the specific mail company, they're not in the, I mean, they become in the business of immigration, but they're not saving those in the same way. Like it's, the records are very, very different. So ship manifests exist, but like what is happening if somebody is landed versus not landed and things like that is really hard to find. But there was a newspaper article that I was able to read. So the newspapers really become the voice of the population in this period. Said that there was one Chinese man who was very ill, but they didn't want, the Pacific Mail company, steamship company, didn't want to let him leave the facility for fear of being charged that $500 fine if he escapes or gets out in some way. And so it wasn't until he was very, very sick that he was allowed to go to a hospital, and he died 2 days later after being admitted to the hospital. And so the conditions really seem horrific. There's a lot, I saw a lot of accounts of people being very ill, but it was not at all clear how that was handled. On staff of the Pacific Mail Company, it didn't seem that they have any doctors, but they did start employing 3 guards at one point. And so we can see where at least the money is going, and where their priorities are.
Yeah.
Any other thoughts or questions? Well, thank you all so much for coming. My dog is getting restless. You can see her starting to show up in the frame. But thank you all so much for coming. We will be sending out a survey probably tomorrow, because we're always looking for what other conversations that Stephen and I can have in comparing our 2 immigration stations. If you've missed any of the past ones, they're all on our YouTube channel. We'll include that as well, and hope to continue to see everybody at events for both of our foundations. But thank you so much for finding the time to spend it with us tonight.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Have a good night.